If you're planning to lease in the Atlanta area, this video will make your life easier. I've been selling real estate here for the last 6 years. I'm going to share with you all my tips and tricks, mainly to keep stress as low as possible, but also to make sure you don't get scammed. Now, the lease process is very different from the buying process. It's less organized and streamlined, so you need to pull from multiple resources at once. There is a greater risk of being scammed by people who don't even own the property that you're interested in. And there are also more opportunities to get screwed by the person renting the property out to you. Landlords all use different contracts depending on who the owner or property manager is. Therefore, there's a higher chance they could slip something into those contracts that you miss, and that could be something that causes massive headaches in the future. Now, it's also easier in many ways than purchasing a home. So if you follow the process I'm going to share with you today, this should be a breeze. You should find a great place that works for you, and you should be able to completely avoid being scammed in any way. Now, I'm going to talk about the pros and cons of renting versus buying in a little bit, but I want to start off with the main challenge in leasing, and it's the same challenge that my buyers face, which is finding the neighborhood that's going to be the right fit for you and your family. There are so many areas around Atlanta that could work great within your budget and needs, but just because you can afford a unit in a given area doesn't mean that neighborhood is going to provide you the lifestyle that you desire. Now, if you're already living in the Atlanta area and you're very familiar with the different neighborhoods, this might not be as relevant for you, but I do work mostly with relocation clients from out of state, and just like buyers, we've got to narrow down which neighborhood is going to deliver on your top priorities. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I've talked about it a lot in the past, but the way that we narrow this down, number one, is commute, because the traffic is so bad here. If you have to commute consistently for work, or you need to be a certain distance from a family member or an amenity like the airport, that is going to create a certain radius that will exclude many areas for you. Next would be your budget. Everyone's working with a budget, and typically you don't have an unlimited budget to buy wherever you want. So you're going to be restricted to certain areas on your budget. You also are looking for a certain size place based on your budget. So obviously the less space you need, the more options for where you can be. And if you happen to need a very large home on a limited budget, there's probably only a few places that are going to check that box for you. And the last two would be schools, which obviously people with school-aged children, they want to enroll their kids in an area with good public schools. That is going to exclude a lot of areas as well. So that will help you narrow it down. And then of course, the overall vibe. Are you looking to be more in town for, city living with lots of things to do at your fingertips? Or are you looking for more of a suburban atmosphere to raise your children that's a little bit more quiet, but still good proximity to Atlanta? Or you may be looking for a much more rural option. You don't care how far you are from the city, and so you may be looking much further out to get that style of home that you're looking for. So use those 4 criteria to begin narrowing down which parts of the city you're looking at, because you simply cannot search effectively over the entire metro. All right, let's talk about what your budget is going to do in different areas of the city. Now, this is going to depend heavily on which type of living space that you need. If you have to have a single family detached home, you're going to need a higher budget typically, and you're going to have less options. It's going to be more difficult to do on a budget because you're renting out an entire house. If you're open to single family homes and attached options like apartment and townhomes, obviously you're going to have way more options to choose from, and those types of options are going to allow people on much lower budgets to find comfortable spaces to lease. Now, I'm going to speak in generalities, so keep in mind this is going to be very area specific. Obviously, the more desirable an area, like let's say for instance, Buckhead or Alpharetta, your budget is not going to go as far as it would in one of the up-and-coming neighborhoods on the west side of Atlanta, or one of the less expensive suburbs, like let's say Stone Mountain. But just to give you a basic sense of what to expect, if you are looking for a single-family detached home that's at least 3 beds, 2 baths, and let's say 1,400 square foot or more, so pretty standard starter home size, you're going to want to plan a budget of at least $1,800 a month or more. Now again, you can probably find something less than that, but there's a good chance it's going to be a much smaller home, or it's going to be in an up-and-coming area that may not provide the safety level that you need. Now, if you need a slightly larger home because you have a larger family, let's say a 4.2 plus and maybe 1,800 square feet or above, I'm going to say you want a starting budget of at least $2,300 a month or more. That should get you a good size space, but keep in mind, we're probably still not in the budget range of properties that are going to be renovated with modern finishes. In this range, we're going to be looking at rental grade finishes. Totally move-in ready, but not necessarily up to date. So if you do need a larger home and you're interested in more modern finishes, granite countertops, tile backsplash in the kitchen, nice appliances, updated vanities, you're going to probably want a budget of at least $2,800 or above. And I would say once you get into $3,500 plus, you really have the pick of the litter in terms of options. You're going to be able to find large homes, up to date, remodeled, many cases, new construction homes for you to rent. So those are just some rough parameters of what to expect for a single family detached budget. Now, if you're open to an apartment and you don't need much space, you can get by on a much lower budget here. Potentially as low as say $1,100 or $1,200 a month could get you a studio or 1-1 and in a decent area, right? And you're gonna have different levels of amenities that go along with that building, and you're gonna have different levels of finishes depending on when that building was built. But of course, being open to an attached option that's smaller is going to allow you to get by on a much lower budget. And as always, the more money that you have, the nicer unit you'll be able to rent. Other options include townhomes, which typically fall in between apartments and single family homes in terms of value and expense. However, keep in mind, you typically don't see very small townhomes. You're typically gonna see at least 2.2 and above. So you may not get that bottom of the barrel pricing that you see with apartments. We also see multifamily homes like a duplex, triplex, or quadplex where you can rent out a unit, and that can be great value as well. And I find typically those are scenarios where you can often be in a very good area. And those multifamily options can often provide a little bit of a different feel between an apartment or a home. Sometimes it's an old historic building with a lot of character. Sometimes it's not, but those can be great options to consider as well, especially if you've had trouble finding something that appeals to you. And the last option I would mention, this is for people who are an extremely low budget, would be something like a boarding house. Maybe you have a home, it could also be an apartment or townhome, where things are rented out by the room. There are websites like Roomster where you can look up who is renting out rooms, and this is where you can find things for as cheap as a few $100s a week to just rent out a room and have a common area like the kitchen and living space. So if you're younger, or if for whatever reason you're on a much stricter budget, just know that those options are available for you. All right, let's talk about how not to get scammed. Here's what you need to look out for. First of all, you have to make sure the person you're contacting and interacting with to negotiate your lease is the actual homeowner or representative of the homeowner. Now, when you're going to buy a home, pretty much everything gets listed on the MLS, and then all the third-party websites like Zillow and Realtor.com take that information and put it into their platforms. But it's all the same information. It's all coming from one source. So it's typically more reliable and streamlined. When you're looking at leases, some landlords will hire agents to put those on the MLS, and those are typically much more reliable. So whether you see it from an MLS search that your agent set up for you, or if you see it in Zillow with an MLS listing, those are typically more solid, less chances of those being scammed because you have a professional agent who is brokering the deal. However, many property managers and owners do not put their property on the MLS. They may just put it directly on Zillow. We're seeing that more lately, where you have Zillow is really pushing their rental platform, right? They want to have total ownership over all aspects of this process. Now, there's nothing wrong with it. Now, I can tell you as an agent, it does make it more difficult to contact the property managers. You have to go through Zillow's platform to set up and request a tour. The responsiveness can be very low. So they've really removed the direct connection to either the agent or the property manager, and it's been a little frustrating for me. But just know, if you're searching on one of those third-party apps, you may be going through and filling out requests to do tours. It may be a while before you can actually talk to someone about whatever you need to know about that unit. And of course, many people will list their rentals on another website like Craigslist or any of the other platforms I mentioned, Roomster, sometimes even Facebook Marketplace. Now, I'm not telling you never to look at those. You can certainly potentially find better than average deals, but you gotta be really careful, especially with Craigslist, because a very common scam is for people to simply advertise properties that they have no connection with. They will take your money from a deposit, tell you that you can go at a certain time, maybe even set up leases, and then you'll never hear from them again, and that property may not be available at all. So don't just assume that if you see the listing online that it's legitimate. You do need to do some digging, and if you're ever unsure, ownership is public record. You don't even have to be a real estate agent to look up who owns a property. You can verify who you're talking with versus who is listed on the public tax records as the owner. Sometimes that owner will be listed as an LLC. That's fine as well. Obviously, you can just ask the owner, hey, what is the name of your company that owns this property, and verify it's the same. And obviously, if they don't know what you're talking about, that's going to be a red flag that maybe you're not talking to the person who actually owns the property. So be careful for that, or work with a realtor who's going to make sure you're in contact with the right person. Now, the other big quote unquote scam to look out for, and it's not really a scam, but it is a potential for you to get in a bad situation, are going to be the contracts that you sign for the lease, okay? Now, in Georgia and pretty much every state, there are realtor association forms for purchasing. This is why you don't need to go get your own personal attorney to review a contract when you go to buy, because we use the same contracts for everything. We know what's in them. And very deliberately, we stay up to date with how they change each year, but there's no mystery, right? There's nothing that's going to be hidden inside these contracts because you can't just change them. These are official state realtor association contracts, and that really eliminates a lot of the risk. Now, of course, you have to look through those contracts and look at the exact terms, but you don't necessarily have to be worried about the default wording in those contracts. Now, that is not the case for listing. All these property management companies typically will have their own lease forms, their own contracts, kind of like new construction companies do. Now, that doesn't mean they're trying to screw you, but it does mean that they can structure these contracts in the most beneficial way possible for them. So let me just give you a very easy, light example of something that I recently pushed back on for a client that was in the contract that, if we hadn't, addressed it, could have created a bad situation for my client. And it had to do with when the property manager was allowed to access the property. Now, on the Georgia Association Realtor forms, you typically see a default where you need to have at least 24-hour notice from the landlord for them to enter the premises of your property, at least, and sometimes you see more. And in this particular contract, it was immediate access. There was no stipulation for how much heads up the landlord needed to give before they came on the person's property. So, practically speaking, if they wanted, they could just knock on your door and you would have to let them in according to the law. You may or may not do that, but that's what was in the contract. So we negotiated with that property manager to create a 48-hour buffer. They could get access to the home, but they had to ask the tenant 48 hours ahead of time so that they could plan and prepare. So again, would that have ever come up as an issue? Maybe, maybe not, but you have to look out for small things like that in the contract. Now, the other aspects of these contracts that you're going to want to look out for, obviously, the money, right? What your security deposit looks like, and what are the circumstances in which that security deposit is going to be returned to you. But also a big one is how much notice you need to give the landlord before you don't want to renew. And this is where a lot of landlords do get very squirrely. They want to be able to give you very little notice to vacate you, as in 30 days or less, but they somehow want you to be giving them at least 60 and sometimes 90 days plus notice before you're going to renew or vacate your lease without, automatically going in to another 1-year lease. So you just want to make sure that you go through this, or have your realtor go through this, and make sure everything is fair and practical. It's not super practical necessarily to have to give a landlord 90 days notice before you want to move out. I've also seen contracts where these leases automatically renew, not month to month, but another full year contract, and they very often have a price increase built in. Now, this is going to be market specific, meaning what type of market are we in and how much leverage do you have as a tenant. I can tell you, as a local real estate agent, rents are softening a bit in Atlanta and landlords have been a little desperate to get their properties filled. So I've been able to push back on a lot of this stuff and get my client better terms. Now, that may not be the case if we have less options available for renters and landlords have the leverage. This is why you kind of need to be aware of how the market is doing related to leases and who has the leverage. Vacancy is very bad for landlords. Every month that property is vacant, not only are they not getting income, they're paying the mortgage and potentially the utilities and the property taxes, and they're losing money. Even 1 month is a huge hit to their profit. So I have found that you can definitely negotiate not having that increase if you're a good tenant, you pay on time, you potentially don't have to increase it every year. It's going to depend, but you can push back with making them realize, hey, okay, if you insist on raising the rent this much, I'm not going to renew, and you're going to be vacant at least 1 to 2 months, and you're going to get a new tenant that you hope pays you on time. So all that to say, it's really important that you go through the contracts or have your realtor or even attorney go through the contracts and that you understand what you're getting into and what your outs are. So as I mentioned, all these contracts are going to be a little different from one another and the terms are typically going to be a little different from one another. But let's talk about what's quote unquote normal. What can you expect? Or what can you expect not to receive when you're going through this process? So let's talk about lease length. A lot of people, especially the ones that want to buy with me, they just want to rent for a few months before they buy. Unfortunately, most landlords are going to make you sign at least a 1-year lease, and some are even insisting on 2-year leases now, though I would never recommend that you sign that. So it's going to be very difficult to find a month-to-month lease or a 6-month or 3-month lease. And if you do, of course, they're going to trump up those prices because, that's what you have to pay for to get those shorter lease terms. So expect to sign at least a 1-year lease term. Now, in terms of the costs, obviously, you're going to have to pay the first month's rent and you're going to have to pay a security deposit, which I've found is typically equal to the first month's rent as well. And many landlords also insist that you put down a cleaning deposit fee for a few $100s so that they can get the unit cleaned once you leave. Now, you can negotiate this, but also keep in mind if they do that, you don't need to clean your place up too much if you've already paid them a few $100s for a professional to do it. So if you do sign a lease with that, make sure you're not on your hands and knees scrubbing the place before you go because you already paid for them to get it deep cleaned. Now, you're also going to have a cost for the application fee. And this is typically for them to run the credit check. And that's usually going to be about $75 to $100 per application. And this is a non-refundable cost. And of course, if you have a pet, there's also typically going to be a refundable pet deposit fee. Typically, we see this is about a couple $100s and it will be returned to you as long as the property is in good condition at the conclusion of your lease. But when discussing pets, keep in mind the landlord may have breed restrictions, right? They can restrict whatever they want because they own the property. So if you have a very large dog, don't just assume you're going to be able to move into any place. If you have maybe a bully breed, although I haven't seen that quite as common, you're just going to want to make sure that your breed and size of dog is going to be okay with the landlord. Now, in terms of what you can negotiate, you can try to negotiate a lot of this stuff. It's going to really have to do with kind of how desperate they are. If the property has just come on the market, and it's just day 2 of the listing, I would not expect to get a lot of compensation or leeway on some of these terms. You're probably going to have to agree to it as is. Now, leases definitely typically stay on the market much longer than listings do. So if you see a property that's been on the market 100+ days, there's no harm in asking for a few $100s off the lease price or, negotiating on some of those terms. I would not expect to get massive discounts, but you may be able to get anywhere from $50 to $200 off the monthly lease term. And certainly you can push back on some of the terms that we've already discussed, like how much notice they need to give you before entering the property, how much notice you need to give them before terminating your lease, and vice versa, and some other terms that go along in the contract. So you can negotiate everything, but I would not get your hopes up that you're going to, really bully them around and tweak everything, because you may come across as difficult and they probably just want to move on to another tenant. So you do want to negotiate, but you want to do it within reason. Now let's talk about how long it takes. And this is a big question for people. A lot of people get stressed out because they think it's going to take as long as buying a home. The good news is that once we do the hard work of figuring out what part of town is going to be right for you and your family, the entire process for the lease does not have to take long at all. landlords want to get you in there as soon as possible, especially if the property is vacant. So you don't need to wait 30 days to close like you do when you're purchasing something. So once you have all your ducks in a row, you know what part of town you want to be in, you know what kind of units that you want to look at, you can start doing your tours, and really, I would say a few weeks before you want to plan to move in, you can start putting in applications. Now you can't do it too far ahead of time because, well, you can, but you're gonna have to pay for something that you don't live in, and a landlord's obviously not going to just hold on to the property for you without some sort of non-refundable down payment. So you can't do it too far in advance, but I would say a few weeks ahead of time, as long as you're seeing a good flow of options, should be plenty of time to submit an application and get something under contract. And the good news is you will probably not see the type of bidding wars that you see when you're purchasing. In fact, you definitely won't. With rentals, it really is first come, first serve. You see a unit, you get that application in. If they approve your application, as soon as you put down the deposit that they're requesting, you have the property reserved. You're not going to be bidding against other people really. So it's really a speed game. You want to get that application in when you find a property that checks all your boxes. All right, let's finish off by talking about the pros and cons of renting versus buying. I recently made a whole video about this, so go back and check that out if you're really on the fence. But just briefly, I wanted to touch on how to help you make this decision if you could go both ways. Now, obviously, one of the big benefits of just purchasing something is that it's one less move, right? If your ultimate intention is to buy anyway, but you rent first, you are now having to move twice. And obviously, moving can be extremely stressful. So whether you're in state or coming from another state, if you come and just purchase something, you're going to be there for a few years. You're not going to have to do multiple moves. Now, maybe you're planning to lease for the foreseeable future and not buy, in which case that would be irrelevant for you, but it is a point I like to mention. Now, the major pro of renting has to be flexibility, right? If, your life situation is fluid, either because of work or family or whatever, yes, you need to sign a 1-year lease, but once that is over, maybe you go month to month, maybe you have a shorter term. But regardless, even worst case scenario, if you had to break the lease, you're going to have more flexibility than if you own. Because if you own and you want to get out of it, and you can't rent it, you're gonna have to sell it. And you have to go through the sales process. And if you just bought it, you may be taking a hit because there are sales costs. So even if the value of the home has gone up a little bit, it has to go up a pretty significant amount before you're going to start profiting. So, if you bounce around, maybe you're in the military or your job moves you around, obviously leasing is going to provide you a higher level of flexibility in terms of where you can be. Now, the other major pro of leasing is going to be cost of living. And again, I'm a huge advocate for purchasing. Obviously, there's a lot of benefits about that, which we'll talk about, but the reality is with interest rates where they're at, there's almost no scenario where your mortgage is going to be comparable or less than a lease. If cost of living, if your monthly budget is your main priority and keeping that low, leasing is typically going to be the better option. Now, if interest rates come down quite a bit and you're able to purchase something at a lower price at a very low interest rate, this might even out a little bit. But with interest rates high, a mortgage typically, especially for a single family home, is almost never going to be less than $2,500 a month. And you can rent for much cheaper than that in a comparable size place. So depending on what your financial goals are, leasing might be the smarter option for you. Now, in terms of the pros of home ownership, this is probably obvious to you, but you're building equity, right? So every payment that you pay is more of the home that you actually own. Whereas when you lease something, that money just goes into the landlord. You're not building up any ownership in anything. So you're not really stacking anything in a piggy bank, so to speak. So equity is a huge pro of owning, as is appreciation. Real estate goes up in value each year, especially in Atlanta. So when you own a home, not only are you owning a greater percentage of it with each payment that you make, but the value of it is increasing every year, and you're going to reap the benefits of that value, whether you go to refinance or you go to sell and make a profit on it. When you lease something, you don't own it. The value of the property is going to go up, but you are not going to reap the benefits of that. Now, there are also a lot of tax benefits to owning a home, especially when you go to sell. And of course, if you're leasing, that's not going to be the case. There really aren't any tax-related benefits to leasing. Although on the subject of taxes, if you own a home, a con would be your property taxes go up every year, right? And so your mortgage is going to go up a little year. Now, you can contest it. you can challenge it and you can get a freeze on it, but property taxes go up, and so your expenses are gonna go up. However, the flip side of that is leases go up each year as well, typically, right? Your landlord is probably gonna wanna at least track inflation, if not more. So you can expect your monthly lease to go up each year, probably at least 2 to 4%, or you may find a great landlord that really appreciates what a great tenant you are, and that could stay the same. But I think it's probably something that you should be prepared for, because most property managers or most owners are going to want to get the most value that they can of their property, and so they're going to raise the rents a bit each year. Now, on the subject of utilities, in most cases, obviously when you own, you're responsible for paying all the utilities. For leases, you typically are also responsible for most of the utilities. However, I have seen many scenarios where the water is built into the lease or another component is built into the lease. So there is at least the potential to save some money on the lease side, although I wouldn't count on it. And then of course, if you're considering a property with an HOA, if you lease, you're almost never gonna have to pay that. The landlord is taking on that cost. And if you buy something with an HOA, that is an additional expense per month that you will have to consider. So there are a lot of pros and cons in terms of renting versus buying, both financially speaking, but also related to your tax situation. So ultimately, you're going to want to think about your lifestyle, how much flexibility that you need, where you see yourself in the next few years and beyond, and also what is your financial goal? What is most important to you? Is it to own something that is increasing in value that you pay down each month, or is it to keep your costs as low as possible and be able to be flexible for your lifestyle? So hopefully that will help you make that decision. So that's pretty much everything. Leasing is really straightforward, but you do really want to have someone helping you, especially if you're out of state. If you don't have someone helping you, just really make sure you're speaking to the actual owner or property manager, and make sure you go through that lease. Make sure you understand what the landlord is allowed to do, what you're allowed to do. Make sure you understand what the process will be for breaking the lease, what the process is for them breaking the lease with you. Please make sure you do a walkthrough where you verify the condition of the property with photos, and you have something signed with the property manager, so that when it's time for you to leave the property, they can't come to you and say, hey, you caused this damage that you know you didn't cause. So yeah, best of luck leasing in Atlanta. I really hope this video was helpful. Thank you so much for watching. I do service leases now. I didn't before, I do now. There is a cost associated, but we can talk about that. So if you need help leasing, book a call with me using the link in the description below. The call is free, and we could talk about your plan and finding a lease in Atlanta and what working with me would look like. So I love it when my viewers become clients. Really appreciate you watching. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already. Comment below what topics you want to see me talk about in the future. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.